Welcome! I'm Jessica Lambert, and today I'm going to be showing you how to do Catenpile weaving. This is the pattern that we're going to be doing in this tutorial. It's a simple summer scarf done with 3/2 tencel. You can also swap in 3/2 cotton if you like. This design scales up in complexity. It starts with a nice straight line so you can get used to the idea of pulling up the loops and chaining them together without having to worry about really anything else. Then we've got this simple Celtic knot here that allows you to experience chaining your loops together in a way that is a little more complex and learn how to cross them. Then we get to really test our abilities with this lovely Celtic knot. It's actually 2 Celtic knots that are interlaced together, and this will give you a fun challenge. Then you get a lovely plain weave break because the rest of the scarf is all plain weave until you reach the other end and you get to do it again. Okay, so I have warped according to the pattern. I have woven my header, and I have woven about an inch of plain weave and then hem stitched. And now I'm all set up to start in on my pattern. So I would like to point out that I am going to be working the pattern in the up shed. That is because the up shed has my selvage threads, both of them, raised. If yours happen to be in the slot, it's okay. Your pattern shed will be the down shed. But you do want to make sure that they are both raised when you are working your pattern. So let's take a look at the chart. So the first part that we're going to be doing is just a very simple straight line. At first we're going to totally ignore these black markings and these red markings, and we're just going to talk about the colored squares. So each square represents a space in between warp threads while you're in your pattern shed. So if I'm actually gonna, so I'll just put my hand in here. So I'm in my pattern shed. I have my warp threads raised, and we're going to ignore all of these warp threads down here. That's not taken into account in our chart. So these spaces in between each warp thread are represented by the columns. So each column is a space in between warp threads. So you can think of the lines separating each column as your warp threads in your pattern shed. So each one that is colored in is a space in which you're going to use your crochet hook to pull a loop from your weft up through the warp. So to demonstrate that, so this one is colored in, that's our very first space, and then it goes every other. That's the pattern we're doing right now. I'm going to just demonstrate in the middle of the warp real quick before I get started. So I'm going to just pull a loop up from this space, and if I pull like this, I'm going to be pulling, you see that it's pulling this area tight? That is what we want to avoid, because that's going to screw up our selvages. It's going to make our fabric just pull together in a way that's going to end up not looking very nice. So instead of that, what we want to do is we're going to pull up, we're going to rotate away from where we want to be pulling that slack from. Okay, so let me show that one more time, okay? Inserting our hook in, hooking that weft, pulling it up, and as we pull it up, we're rotating it. Oops, hold on. As we're pulling up, we are rotating it to make sure that we're pulling from the right direction. then we insert around our knitting needle. And if you want, you can give your weft a little tug to make sure it is kind of just not too tight. You don't want it, you know, distorting the fabric. So just nice and snug on there. All right, so let's get started for real. So that first space was colored in, so we're going to come here to our first space in between our warp threads, and we are going to, pull that loop up. Then insert our needle. Now, our next stitch is right here, so it's going to be tempting to just hold our knitting needle right at the ready to, you know, to pull it up like this. And just slip it on right away. The problem with that is, if you'll see, this stitch has now been pulled tight around the tapered end of the needle rather than the full width of it. And since this is the size that we want our stitches to be, we don't want to be pulling them, you know, so that they're small. So make sure that if you're working two stitches that are close together, you just go ahead and go past it. You angle it so that you can reach what you need to reach. Pull that stitch up, and once it's pulled up, then pull your needle back and insert around your stitch. Okay. So you'll notice that each one is kind of pulled tight as I do the next one, and that's fine. As long as we're not distorting our fabric, then we're fine. We do want those loops to be tight, or, you know, kind of snug, not too tight. So let's see what happens if I start pulling this a little too tight. All right, so I'm gonna pull that. You see how these stitches, these warp threads are now right up next to each other, and it's actually kind of happening to this one too. That's what we don't want to see. So we're gonna just keep going along, pulling it out, keeping things nice and loose, but not too loose. The main thing that will determine how good this looks, other than just, you know, making sure the stitches are in the right place and all that, is the size of these stitches. If they're too tight, you're going to end up pulling the fabric together and it's going to ripple. If they are too loose, then your design on the top of the fabric is going to kind of be poofy and not very well defined. We are just about at the end here. I'm going to lift up this last stitch, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and bead it and change sheds. So we've been ignoring the lines on here. Basically, now that we have our loops, we have to determine the path through them. With a line, like this simple part, it's pretty easy to tell where you're supposed to go. As you can see up here, it'll be a little bit more complicated to know which stitch you're going to go to next. So, oh, I'm holding it upside down. Okay, so it doesn't show up great on the video, but you'll see in the pattern there is a large red circle right here, and there's a small red circle over here. So the large one, think of that as the opening. That's at the beginning, so that's where we're going to start. And then this red line here, this red line segment, as you can see, it's up there too, shows which direction you go from there. Obviously with this bit, there's really only one direction to go. So we're gonna start on our left-hand side and move across. All right, now that we are in the non-pattern shed, these loops are fairly secure, and we can go ahead and pull this knitting needle out. Now we're going to chain these together. So with this first stitch, I like to give it a little twist. It makes things look a little cleaner. So I just put it in this wrong side, and then I rotate it around, and that just gives it a nice closed beginning that doesn't look too open. So if you've crocheted before, this will seem rather natural to you. You'll hook that loop, rotate so that your hook is, like this tip of the hook is pointing down. That'll make it the easiest to get a nice clean pull through. So we just follow the path. Now I am doing this with my non-dominant hand. The reason for that is later on, as we're doing those kind of twisty patterns, you're going to be going both directions. And so no matter how you orient things, you're going to be doing things in a way that is a little bit counterintuitive, I guess, at some times. So I just try to keep it so that I'm pulling those loops up with my dominant hand, and then I do this part either way. All right, so we're at the end here, and we need to secure this. All right, we've got this open loop. We need a way to tie it down. In order to tie down this loop, what we need to do is we need to bring this tail end of the yarn over to it. So we're going to go on back through the warp to that space that's right next to, oh, here, let's look at this, try it again. Okay, so this small red circle marks where we're going to be working our knot. So that is the space that we want to be bringing our shuttle through. So I've just done that. I've brought the shuttle through this very last space in our warp, and now I have, you know, some yarn to work with. So I'm going to hook that, rotate it under to pull it through. Okay, I'm going to pull this loop rather large, and then I'm going to feed my shuttle through it. All right, so now we can pull that tight, and there it is, it's knotted. All right, so now we're going to go back through the way we came, and you'll notice it's kind of drifted up a bit, so we're going to go ahead and beat again. Now we're going to go into our non-pattern shed. So every row that is represented in this chart represents a pattern shed row. You can think of the lines in between them as being the picks in between our pattern picks. So we are going to weave just a normal plain weave pick here. Okay. Okay, now we're back into our pattern shed. The next row in the chart is blank. So we are just going to weave another normal pick. Then, because after every pattern row, we have just a regular plain weave pick in between, do one more before we're ready to proceed with the next section. Okay, so we are back into our pattern shed, and we'll take a look at the chart. This is still a fairly simple pattern, but it is definitely more complex than the straight line. So we have 4 rows here, meaning we have 4 pattern picks and 4 non-pattern picks. So we're working this over the course of a total of 8 picks, meaning that we're not going to chain anything until we have finished that final row. All right, so counting these real quick, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. before our first loop. So let's count those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then that next one is where we're going to pull up a loop. And we're going to make sure we rotate so that the slack comes from the right direction. And we are going to do another stitch directly next to that one. Then we're going to skip 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. We're going to pull this stitch up. And we're going to skip 1. Then I'm going to skip 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Do 2 stitches next to each other. Skip 3. Do 2 stitches separated by one space. 1, 2, 3. 2 together. Okay, and we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spaces left on our end. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we are now done. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and beat that, change sheds, and then because we're not securing yet, we're going to just leave that knitting needle in there. It'll be just fine, and that way we don't have to hold it unnecessarily long. And then in order to not be affected by the fact that there's a knitting needle there in my bead, I just angle it a little bit so that it's beading kind of underneath that knitting needle. All right, so now we're back in the pattern shed. Pass the shuttle through and refer to our chart. So after the first row in a motif, I don't like to count really too much. So I just pay attention to how close things are together. So this first stitch is going to be 2 spaces over and 1 space up. And then it's going to be the same on the other side, 2 together. We're just going to keep referencing that as we go. So 2 spaces over and 1 space up. We're already 1 space up because we're in the next pattern pick. So we just need to count 2 spaces over. So here's that stitch. We're going to follow that warp thread up. Then we're going to count over 1, 2, and pull that loop. All right, then we're doing 1, 2 over here. And that one has one directly next to it. And then we're directly next to this one. Well, we're just 1 over from that one. And one directly next to it. Alright, so that's that. We beat. We're going to do this. And I'm getting out of my sweet spot. And so I'm going to advance my warp after this one. Beat that. We're going to go into the neutral shed. Okay, we're going back up into our pattern shed. Throwing the shuttle. And now this next row is going to be really easy because it's what I like to call a stacked row, wherein every stitch, or sorry, every loop that we do is directly on top of every loop that we have in the previous one. So it's going to be real easy. So we're just going to mirror, copy what we've already done. So one of the pitfalls, one of the mistakes that is easy to make as you're trying this out for the first time is to pull those selvages really tight on the pattern rows and not so much on the plain weave rows. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to that. See, it's very easy to end up like having this pull in at the point where this patterning is happening. As long as you keep your stitches nice and loose and you're using the right size knitting needle, it shouldn't be too hard. But part of it also can have to do with keeping your weft too loose on the non-pattern rows, just because you're distracted. So you want to make sure that that stays straight, whether you're doing plain weave or patterning. So now we're doing this last row of loops for this motif. All right, and it is the same as the first one. So I'm actually just going to copy that row by following that warp thread up and just mirroring what's down here. Hold on. Now, one thing to be aware of is that if you make a mistake on the placement of your loops, say you put a loop is supposed to be in this warp space and you get confused and you accidentally put it here, it's actually fairly easy to fix later on. You can continue with your weaving and you'll be way past it, and as long as you haven't already chained it, it's really easy to actually just slip it over to the next spot. What is really hard to fix, though, is if you just skip over a loop entirely. The only way to fix that is actually to weave back to it and do it over, because you can't make that length of yarn just come out of nowhere. You'll just pull your fabric tight in that spot and make everything worse. So make sure you have the right number of loops, because even if you have them in a slightly wrong place, as long as you have the right number of loops, it'll be easy to fix later on. Obviously, it's easier to just get it right the first time, but it's helpful to know that mistakes can be fixed. All right, so we have finished all 4 of these pattern rows. So on our chart, we don't have a big circle and a small circle like we did over here. We have looks like a target. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna start where it tells us to start, and that's also gonna be where we're tying our knot. And we're gonna close everything up and make it look nice and seamless. Well, relatively. So this black line is showing us our path, and you'll notice that in certain places it has double black lines. That signifies that there's a cross. So this arm is crossing over, like crossing that arm, and the side that is double is the side that you want to see on top when you cross. So we will be paying attention to that as we go along. So we're going to start, first we've switched sheds, so we're in the non-pattern shed. That's important because you don't want these loops to be slipping around too much as we're working with them. Because sometimes as we're working with them, one will get bigger than the other as it pulls length from the loop that's next to it, and that's okay to a point because usually it'll just be fixed later on, but you don't want to be able to just like pull a loop into non-existence. So we're going to start here. I'm not going to worry about that twisting because I'm going to be closing this up later. So I'm just going to get started. I'm going to move the direction of that red line, and see, this is what I meant about it being kind of funky, because just then I was using my right hand, but unlike with crochet, if you're familiar with crochet, if that's something you've done, where you're able to move your fabric to wherever is comfortable for your hands to work, this is stuck on the loom. It's not going anywhere. So we have to kind of move our hands in slightly weird ways to make the loop happen where, like make things happen where they need to happen, because we can't manipulate the fabric to do it where it's more comfortable for us. Okay, so we're here. We've got these 4 stitches that are close together. If we pay attention to our chart, we'll see that this is meant to cross. So we are going to cross just like this. All right, and in our chart, it's showing that this arm that we're doing right now is meant to cross over. So when we get back to the other side of that cross, we're gonna have to work that under. All right, so now we're back to this cross. And we're crossing diagonally. Okay, and I just switch back and forth between my 2 hands, whichever feels more comfortable at that particular angle. It's the one I use. So I'm starting to go up again, and I switch to my left hand. So we're not really worried just yet about which arm of the chain, like which section is crossing over which one, because we haven't crossed over anything yet. We're going to get all the way over here, and then as we go back, we're going to have to pay attention to that. So anytime I have 2 loops next to each other, it has a tendency to, as I'm working one stitch, to kind of pull the stitch that's next to it a little bit smaller. Let's see if you can see that. So you'll see that this loop right here is kind of shrunk a little bit. It's not really a problem because we're going to be coming back to that loop, and as we pull it, it will pull the other stitch smaller until they're both basically the size that they should be. So it's not really a problem, but don't go crazy, because then you don't want that to just disappear entirely, because it'll make it a little bit harder to figure out where that loop was supposed to be in the first place when it comes time to pull it back up. So just be gentle anytime you have 2 stitches directly next to each other. Okay, so now we've gotten to the end and we're heading back the other way. So as we do this, we want to pay attention to our chart and which of these crosses are we going to be going over and which ones we're going to be going under. So on the chart, basically, you'll notice all the ones that cross over are slanted this way. So as we come down, we're going over. As we go up, we're going under. All right. So this first one, we are going down. So this will go over. So the overs are nice and simple. You just basically continue chaining on your merry way without having to worry too much about it. Now we're coming to an under, and this is a little bit more complicated. So what we're going to do is we're going to chain right up until the part where we need to cross, if we can find that loop. Okay, here we go. So if I just stitch this, if I just hook it and go through, that's going to be going over, and that's not what we want. We need this arm, this needs to be going under, and this needs to be going over. So how we do that is we go back to this stitch. So we're right up until the part where we need to cross, and we take our hook and we go to the opposite side of that chain and poke it back through. Now we hook that stitch we just came out of, that we just left behind, and we pull it through to the other side of that arm. Now we need to put our our crochet hook back in, going the right direction. And then we can carry on our merry way. And see, we have this one going over and this one going under, just like we want. Once again, we're crossing under. So I'm going to go to the far side of the stitch I need to cross under. I'm going to insert my hook through it. And I'm going to pull that loop up. Sometimes you lose this loop and you have to go back and chain it again. But if you're careful, you can just pull that through to the other side. You slip your hook out, then back into that stitch going the right direction. We do that so that we don't end up twisting it. Then continue chaining. Okay, so now we've pulled through our last loop, and we have two problems here. One is that we have this loose, we have this one last loop that is loose, and that will slip, and our whole pattern will unravel if we don't secure it. And also the problem is that we have a start and a stop, and we want to make sure that we close this loop up in a way that also connects it to this first loop. Okay, so in order to do this, we need some yarn to work with. So unlike this line where we tied up the knot before we did any more weaving, we're actually going to weave one more pick, or at least part of a pick. So we're in the opposite shed already, and we're going to throw the shuttle. And we are going to just take a quick look, hold on, leave that there for a moment, at our chart, and we're going to notice, well, we already kind of know where the knot needs to be because we know where that opening is that we need to close. But we're going to notice that red circle is marked, and we're going to want to bring our shuttle up through the best place in between those two stitches that we're going to want to close to connect to each other. So we haven't gone all the way through because we've come out at this point. All right. So now what we need to do is, see this first loop? We're going to go under both arms of that stitch. We're going to grab our working yarn and we're going to pull it through both of those stitches. All right. So now we've got those connected, and we've got a loop that we can pull as large as we want. So you guessed it, we're going to pass our shuttle through this. Okay, now once we've got it through, we'll go ahead and secure that. I like to hold the stitches down just to make sure nothing, I don't know, starts growing too big. And as we do this, we want to make sure that this weft isn't getting pulled too tight, or it's not like too loose, like it's bubbling up too much. This is a nice nice curve that's going to give us enough weft for the take up of the weave without causing any bunching or looseness. Now we're going to look where we came out of the warp, and we're going to go back in the same way we came, and we're going to just finish out that pick. Pull that nice and tight, well, nice and snug, not too tight, and beat. And at this point you want to check to make sure that you don't have any bunching or any pulling, and if you do, you might want to go back, undo that knot, and make sure that that weft has enough, or not too much slack, and that it looks neat. Okay, so we have completed this second motif. Yay! All right, so let's take a look at the chart. Once again, we have one space, one row in between our motifs. So that means we've just woven our one pick, our one normal pick. We need to weave two more picks before we're back in the pattern shed, and we're going to start on this motif. All right, so let's do that, and we'll talk about the next motif. So like I said, we're ramping up. So the next one is the most complex part of this pattern. It's essentially the same though. It's the same principles. So we can handle it. Keeping my selvages straight. I'm making sure that I'm not too loose here and that my selvages are going to match in this plain weave bit to the pattern bit. All right, so now I'm set up to do my next pattern pick. So I'm going to throw the shuttle and make sure that I have plenty of slack on the shuttle side, but then this selvage is nice and snug. Okay, let's take another look at the chart. So you'll notice that we have two different motifs that are interlaced. These are not connected. We're not going to be chaining this blue part and this yellow part together at any point. They do cross over each other, but they are not linked. So you'll also notice that this yellow part starts one row before the blue and it also ends one row after. So as we finish off pulling up all of the loops for this blue part, we're going to need to close that off before we continue on pulling up these loops. We also are going to be doing quite a few more rows before we get to the part where we're chaining. Chaining is a great part to notice mistakes. So since we're going a longer period pulling up loops without chaining them, we're going to want to pay extra attention to what we're doing to make sure we're not making mistakes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And our first stitch, our first loop is in the next one. On this row, we're going to continue with our yellow pattern, but it's also where this blue one starts. So our first stitch it's quite a bit out from that, so I'm going to go ahead and count from the edge. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're skipping 6 warp spaces. All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we pull up 1 and 2. All right, that is the final row in this blue motif. So we need to close that up before we finish up the rest of the yellow one. So we're going to do it the same way as we've done this down here. The only real difference is that, of course, it's bigger, but also that we have all of these other stitches that are quite close in places to the stitches we're actually working on. So this is probably the most complicated part of this particular pattern where we're most likely to make mistakes. So you want to spend plenty of time making sure you're getting the stitches right. So we've changed sheds so that these loops won't slip around. So we'll remove that. The red circle is right here, and that corresponds with this stitch right here. So that is where we're going to start. And we're going to follow that red line is pointing the direction we need to go. Alright, so I've just noticed that I made a mistake. So right here, you'll see I have these two loops here that are separated by a little bit more room. And these two are supposed to be just as far apart, but they're not. They're close together. So as I was looping things, I put one of the loops in the wrong place. But I have the right number of loops, so this should be very easy to fix. I just go over to where the loop is supposed to be, go kind of through my fabric and pull that yarn over to where it's meant to be. I can go ahead and go back to chaining. And there's our last stitch. So we're going to do this the same way we did the last one. Pass the shuttle through, and then right here is where we want to come out. So pull that out. Now we have the yarn we need to do our closing knot. So we go under the two arms of that first stitch and pull a loop through the first stitch, and, well, more under that first stitch and through the last stitch. Pull this loop large, pass the shuttle through it, and tighten our knot. And we're going to double check that the weft looks good inside the warp. It does. And pull that tight. Okay, there we go. I'm going to go back into the warp with my shuttle, back the way we came, and out the side. Beat that and back up into our pattern shed. So this first motif, this yellow, or sorry, this is the blue one, marked in blue on the chart, is finished. So we're going to go ahead and work this last row of the yellow one. Okay, so we're starting in a similar place with this motif as we did on the first one, that kind of top corner of the leftmost loop. So that's it. From now on, we're not going to be doing anything we haven't already done. We've got our main star here, and we're just going to basically do these two over again exactly the way we did them before. I went ahead and finished these last two bits off camera, and now the whole chart is done. So one thing I want to point out is that this looks rather tall, and there's kind of a lot of space in between these things, but just keep in mind that as you take it off the loom and wet finish it, everything's going to come together a little bit more. So at this point, all that's left to do is plain weave up until about this much of the end, and then we're going to repeat this pattern on the other side. And that makes it so that the ends, which are the part that you're going to see most clearly when you're wearing the scarf, are embellished, but then you've got a scarf that's nice and drapey. I hope you enjoy this pattern. I hope that this is something that you can add to your weaving arsenal to have a little bit more fun. I know sometimes the rigid heddle loom can feel a little bit limiting because it's not, you know, like an 8-shaft floor loom, and this is one more way that you can make your rigid heddle weaves a little more ornate without having to, you know, get a 3 heddle setup or something like that. So I hope you enjoy, and I'm planning on designing lots more of these patterns, and I hope to see lots of you play around with this as well. So thanks for joining me, and happy weaving.